Developer Techland first tried their hand in the open-world zombie melee genre with Dead Island back in 2011. 4 years later, they followed it up with a far more polished and mature take with Dying Light. After 7 long years, they have finally released its sequel, and I think the best way to describe it is simply better. Set 20 in-game years after the original, it improves in every single area possible over their previous efforts. The movement and combat have never felt better. The writing, voice acting, and story are a bit more hit or miss, but even there, things are much improved over the original. This is a game full of choices that seem to matter. So, let us find out together if you should choose to give this one a shot. In the XboxEra review of Dying Light 2, Stay Human. You begin your journey out in the wilderness as Aiden, who is a pilgrim. They brave the infested wilds, bringing deliveries, information, and supplies for what is normally a very short career. The tutorial for this game is lengthy and comprehensive. Cooperative play was not enabled during the review period, so I'm not 100% sure exactly when it opens up. But once you make it to the game's main location, the tutorials were still popping up for me almost 25 hours in, as this is a big game. Though you can choose to mainline the story if you prefer, and complete things more quickly. It is a big, messy plot with convoluted twists, loose ends that were never resolved, motivations that were never explained or made no sense, and some incredible highs. Even with 7 years since the original, this game still feels like it has a lot of elements that were left unfinished story-wise. I've had the end credits roll, yet over half the game's story threads still feel unresolved to me, and I do not understand the main protagonist's motivations for his actions fully. The characters are generally well written, at least the main ones are, and they're accompanied by rock-solid voice acting, again, for the main ones. Your character, Aiden, is by far the best in the game, and only matched at times by the character Rosario Dawson voices and provides the likeness for. And this is a damned good thing, because Aiden talks a lot. He's quite the chatterbox, but his voice actor was so fantastic that I never minded it for a second. Saying much more about the plot would ruin some early reveals, so just know that the main character's motivations are nice and clear, and I felt that the choices I had to make throughout the campaign seemed to really matter. I'll need to see what other players chose and how things turned out differently, but I came away satisfied with the ending I got, even if it was odd being dumped in the game world to finish up side content and having every other main character in the game just start standing around like a mannequin with nothing to say seemingly forever. Dying Light 2's story may have some major issues, but its gameplay certainly does not. Urban freerunning is the heart of this franchise, and thankfully, unlike the first entry, you start out already rather capable. There is a leveling system for both parkour and combat, but they add to an already great feeling system instead of slowly building it into one. Both work on an experience system and are tied to your overall health and stamina upgrades. Those come in the form of story context sensitive consumables. Everything you do contributes to these parkour and combat experience meters in some small way, and the constant dopamine hit of numbers going up never gets old. There is also a much slower overall leveling system, which is tied into how difficult each area of the map will be, and what strength weaponry and gear you can find or buy from the various vendors dotted around the city. As you progress through the main story, you'll unlock various tools which assist in your movement, while also keeping things fresh, as running from rooftop to rooftop always feels good, but it can get a bit old when you've done the same path 100 times in a few hours. Oddly enough, jump is on the right bumper, which took some getting used to, but after a few hours it did feel natural. Combat will be familiar to anyone who played the first game, though much like with the movement, you are far more capable from the start. Everything difficult that you do ends up being dictated by a typical stamina meter. Running, climbing ladders, and jumping are not part of that meter, which helps a lot as you are rarely forced to slow down. Tougher things such as climbing up walls, hanging on ledges, and swinging quickly drains your stamina meter, and certain parts of the map are inaccessible until you've upgraded that enough. The movement flows together magnificently, and the upgrades, which unlock things like wall running, add spice at the right times. Overall, it's one of the best feeling first-person games I've ever played. Combat-wise, there is a heavy emphasis on parrying by blocking right as the attack is coming at you, and dodging, then following up with counterattacks. Weapon variety isn't really that much of a thing. There are a bunch of different, similar-feeling blunt one- and two-handers, and similar-feeling bladed one- or two-handers, along with a few bows for ranged attacks. Unless I missed it, I don't think there are any guns in this game, unlike the last one. Durability, though, is still a thing, and attaching mods can restore a chunk of it, but in the end, everything you find or buy will eventually break. You get so many drops that I didn't end up minding it much, but some way of repairing on the fly, even if it was more costly than in the first game, would have been appreciated, unless I somehow missed it. Your armor is tied to a very light class system and features items suited for medics, tanks, brawlers, and rangers. There are no set bonuses. The system simply determines which stats your gear will feature depending on the role. I barely paid attention to it in the end, and just went with the highest quality piece the majority of the time. The default difficulty here feels far easier than the original title, thanks in large part to just how much more capable your character is. To offset this, there are incredibly difficult areas of the game littered throughout the map, which require you to visit them at night. Nighttime itself is also far less scary, with the volatiles that terrorized me in the first game only seeming to exist either near the end of the campaign, or if I accidentally set off a chase by getting too close to a howler. Those, of course, are part of the decent-sized menagerie of special infected, and as their name suggests, they yell like a maniac and get seemingly half the planet to start running after you until you can get either far enough away or into a safe house which bathes you in its beautiful purple UV lamp goodness. In this post-apocalyptic world of everyone is infected, there is a constant worry of disease progressing when you're not in the sun or under one of those UV lamps. To keep an eye on this, everyone wears a biomarker that keeps track of your infection, lets you know how close you are to turning. For large parts of this game, you'll either be out at night or indoors where the sun can't reach, and that starts a timer for turning, which is very short at the beginning. I had what felt like a little over half of the health and stamina upgrades, which each add a little bit more to that timer, and I went from roughly 2 or so minutes at the beginning to over 9 minutes on my turn into a zombie timer by the end of my 31-hour playthrough. There are also a large number of consumables that refill this meter as well, so what was quite a nuisance at the beginning ended up being something easy to manage not very long in. The main dynamic of this world is the push between the two factions you'll be working alongside. Through your choices, you'll determine who takes over what parts of the city as you progress, and this is where the choices I mentioned matter quite a bit. I do remember an early pitch for the game mentioning how one area of the city would become flooded if you made a certain choice and therefore be inaccessible, but I didn't see anything like that. It felt a lot more cookie cutter. There are various utility stations for water or electricity that you can traverse to turn back on. Once you get them up and running, you are then asked which faction to assign them to. Each has its own linear path of unlocks to help you out, but story-wise, I don't think these really made much of a difference. The only story-changing decisions happened during main story missions themselves, and these other choices were made in the open world and were only locked behind a stamina requirement at times. It feels like an area where scope creep could have come into play, and their original vision had to be toned down quite a bit, but it works well for what it is. The writing and story are, as previously stated, heavily flawed, but contain some real emotional highs. A lot of this comes down to the incredibly unbalanced voice acting. Jonah Scott's work as a protagonist Aiden is fantastic, and I hope he becomes a mainstay if the series continues. The humanity and humor he's able to bring to lines that should sound cheesy saves what would have been otherwise a completely forgettable character. The only other performance of note is that of the aforementioned Rosario Dawson. She pours a lot into her character, and her interactions with Aiden were the highlight of the game for me. The majority of the other characters, main and side alike, are very mid-2000s sounding. Truly awful accents, over-the-top bad guy snarls or crazy murderer yells. It would fit well in a Z-tier Eurojank action film, and it contrasts terribly when compared to the main characters. You can skip every single voice line at the press of a B button, which I did find myself doing often after reading the line through the subtitles. One of my absolute favorite parts of the game, though, is the soundtrack. There's some licensed music on hand, but I'm talking about the original background music. If the voice acting is a C overall, the OST is an A. There is a track that crops up when things are at their most hectic and epic that has been stuck in my head for days. Overall, it added a level of quality to everything that elevated the emotional story beats significantly. Graphically, things stack up quite nicely as well. There are 3 basic modes on offer here which feel almost standard during this cross-gen period. There is Resolution mode, which aims to keep up the native resolution while offering 30 frames per second. Quality adds in ray-traced lighting and relies on a dynamic resolution while trying to maintain that same 30 FPS. But Performance mode is where I spent almost all of my time in this playthrough, as it offers up a much cleaner looking 60 frames per second experience, and for those lucky enough to have a variable refresh rate capable display, they unlock the frame rate, offering counts that felt far above 60 in practice. The quality and visual modes also look like they're draped in Vaseline in comparison, and they felt far more sluggish gameplay wise. It's not a technical powerhouse, but the scope of the city is large enough that the graphics get the job done. On the other hand, I did run into quite a few bugs, mostly associated in 2 areas, movement and sound. Far too often, I found myself stuck floating an inch above the ground, and only repeated presses of the jump or dodge buttons would dislodge me. The other main bug to hit was one that happened a few times, where all the sound would drop except for this constant, loud buzzing, which persisted until I had restarted the game. Quick Resume worked fine on my Series X, but as online was completely unavailable during review, I have little hope that this will be the case once the game is looking to be in that always online state for co-op play. In conclusion, Dying Light 2 is a messy, but overall brilliant game. For all my issues with it, there is no denying just how fun it is to play. It has some of the best movement in a first-person title, which is matched by solid combat, choices that helped me shape the narrative how I wanted. It doesn't always hit, but boy, when it does, it hits hard. Literally and figuratively. For as many times as I picked myself up after taking a beating, I had to pick my jaw up off the ground after an incredible set piece. Alone or with friends, I'm not sure there will be a more fun time to have, at least gameplay-wise, this year. Liking, commenting, and subscribing really does help us grow, but the best way is if you visit us at patreon.com/XboxEra. We'll see you here next time.